welcome everyone to the what was supposed to be the second Art and Design Research Forum, but we have had to postpone the first, so this is now the first of our 4 annual forum events. So on behalf of myself and my co-director of Research and Engagement, Bianca Hester, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands I'm joining from today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with us today. I'd also like to acknowledge my privilege as a European settler in being able to live and work on these lands for the past 15 years, to affirm that these lands were never ceded, and to acknowledge the ongoing effects of colonisation today. So if people would like to acknowledge the lands they're joining from today, please go ahead and do so in the chat. We're just going to hand straight over to Zoe to introduce this session. Bianca and I would just like to make a quick announcement to ask everyone in art and design just to heed the call from Ed, the head of school, recently to please attend to any issues with your AROC submissions right away, because we're racing to finalise and close the AROC review process this year, and we've got quite a few outstanding issues, so please do that if you can this week. And just to note that we've switched from last year to recording these talks, and we're going to archive them on the UNSW Art and Design website. And if people are asking questions or making comments during the talks, which we invite you to do, just please be aware that that's being archived, and we ask you to get in touch with us if you have any concerns about having your recordings up there. And without further ado, I'll just hand straight over to Zoe to introduce this session.
Thanks, Ollie. I'm just going to now share. So thank you, Ollie and Bianca, for the opportunity to chair this research forum on making and materiality. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal and Bidjigal people as the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm situated today. I pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us, and extend this respect to elders past and present. I recognise First Nation people's continuing connection to land and culture. I'd also like to thank the speakers for taking part in this forum. Thanks, Nicole, Peter, Consuelo and Matt. I'll be introducing each speaker prior to their presentation. To introduce the research theme of material forces in making practices, I'll briefly refer to my experiences as a maker of contemporary jewellery, and particularly to a series of jewellery and vessels I created in metal for a solo exhibition at Jewellery Gallery early last year. To make this work, I engaged primarily with the forces of heat and compression by using a silversmithing torch to both anneal and join the metal, and a rolling mill to compress metal into thin sheet. Conceptually, the work responded to memories of place and movements through landscapes of personal resonance. The site of Redleaf holds significant connections to my childhood, as I spend many summers swimming there. So the opportunity to exhibit at the new Jewellery Gallery, which is situated right there, in 2022 prompted me to retrace the journey I used to take from where I lived in Paddington through the winding streets and hilly terrain to Redleaf Pool. Using photographic documentation of the landscape along this journey as a starting point for new work, I experimented with traditional jewellery methods to create sheets of conglomerate metals and to test the painterly effects of silver solder, a critical material for joining metal, but not used traditionally as a visible material. I repurposed test pieces and offcuts from previous projects in metal, which involved piecing together tiny sections of copper, silver, brass and gold to create patterned surfaces. This use of repurposing kind of was echoing the memories, my childhood memories of this place. These surfaces were gradually built by repeated sequences of heating, soldering, and rolling. Despite years of working with these materials, during the development of each piece, I had to still relearn, in a way, how to work with the flow of metal by observing the reactions of each alloy under my torch flame, and to know how far to push the material by recognizing moments of resistance. At each stage of the process, in between soldering and rolling and sanding, I photographed the visual beauty of the metal's coloration, the unexpected and unpredictable moments when the copper turned dark red or black or purple. Copper, brass, silver, and gold are malleable metals, but there are limits to their malleability. When compressed and thinned in the rolling mill, the metal becomes rigid and therefore needs to be re-annealed to be pliable and workable again. To achieve a uniform surface, this annealing and rolling sequence is repeated multiple times, but there is a point when the metal starts to break down, as if too exhausted from the stresses of the external forces of heat and compression. So the process requires close attention to any signs of fatigue, including splits in the metal. Metal can't be pushed too far or exploited. Guiding the process in the making of these works was what the anthropologist and academic Tim Ingold describes as intuition in action, a mutual responsiveness involving ongoing questions and responses between me as the maker and the material. How many times could I solder the work before the silver solder started to disintegrate? How much force could I apply to the metal in the rolling mill? Only at the very end of the making process, when the finely sanded piece was dipped in a blackening solution, revealing the painterly effects of the silver solder, was the final patterning fully realized. Further questions: how would the different alloys react in this final blackening stage? Which metals would recede and which would become more pronounced? The outcome was always unknown, and therefore this surprise element was a compelling driver of the project. In other words, this making approach wasn't hylomorphic, a predominant model of making in Western traditions in which form is imposed onto matter. Rather than working towards a pre-planned drawing or fixed idea, the patterns gradually emerged through a direct engagement with the forces of materiality, through a mode of correspondence with the potentialities, resistances, and flows of the metal. There are other instances in my work where considerable planning takes place prior to working with materials, and where the use of drawing, for example, is a key tool. But this particular series of metal forms emphasize the mutual responsiveness or exchange between me as the maker and the materials that was necessary to realize the design. This provides a very brief insight to my practice and making mentalities as a way to introduce the forum. Each speaker was approached to discuss their work due to their direct and often sustained engagement with materials. Through this focus, diverse methodologies across art and design practice are represented. So, Nicole Monks is a multidisciplinary creative of Yamaji and Wajari and European heritage living on Awabakal country in Newcastle. Nicole's practice is informed by her cross-cultural identity, using storytelling to connect the past, present, and future. Nicole's works take a conceptual approach that is embedded within narratives and aim to promote conversation and connection. An award-winning designer and artist, Nicole crosses disciplines, working with furniture, objects, textiles, video, installation, and performance. Across these varied contemporary forms, her work reflects Aboriginal philosophies of sustainability, innovation, and collaboration. Nicole is well known for her success as a solo and collaborative practitioner and founder of Black and White Creative, which focuses on design, and Milli Milli, focusing on public art. Nicole currently sits on the UNSW Galleries Advisory Board the Design Advisory Panel for the Powerhouse Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences. Nicole is the winner of the UNSW Art and Design Indigenous Professional Development Award, Arts New South Wales Aboriginal Design Grant, Vivid Design Competition, and Sydney Design Award. Nicole's works are collected nationally, including the Powerhouse Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences, the National Gallery of Victoria, and the Art Gallery of WA. Thanks, Nicole, and welcome.
Thank you, Zoe. I would like to start today by thanking firstly the Gadigal people, who are the continuing custodians of the land on which UNSW Art, Design and Architecture stands, and also the Wabakal Moramai mob, where I am currently today. I would like to thank elders past and present and future for taking care of country and all connections, both material and immaterial. So I'd like to thank the Aboriginal knowledge holders also who have carved the pathways on which our generations walk today. It is their resilience and strength that has maintained us since the beginning of time. So hi, everyone, and thanks for being here today. And thanks for that really long intro, Zoe. I am Nicole Monks, and I'm just going to jump straight into it and talk about how materiality becomes part of my creative process. So to begin with, I am a multidisciplinary creative, and for me, what that means is working across a multitude of art and design practices and their intersections. So I work conceptually, often starting with a story or a feeling that I'm grappling with, and then I let the works unfold from there, including the materiality. But for me, it's also the immaterial that plays a huge part in my work. So what does that mean? I know we're here to talk about the tangible, but for me, it's also the intangible that becomes embedded within the material. For me, I don't see any lines between my creative practice and my everyday being, my relationships with self and my relationships with community, the materiality of a belonging and the materiality of my body. So everything is connected and everything has a role to play if we let it. So when I come to making work with cultural meaning or story, it's the intention that I come with that is kept in check by what I call my radar. It's all immaterial at this stage, I know, and I'll come back to that part later on. But the most important thing, and this will often determine, affect, change, and develop the work, including the materiality, is this intention. So my first step towards materializing a work is my body. So it's something I need learning or knowledge or understanding about. And then it's about giving this over to be guided by the process of this unfolding. And so this will be different for every different work. And for example, it could include protocols, energy, both positive, negative, feedback, giving enough time and space to a project, building relationships, the semi-conscious, sleeping on things, finding connections and patterns, meeting people, stories untold, and things that reveal themselves. So looking at materiality through this lens, it becomes about relationship, pattern, and connection, and the resonance that is created between self and material. So the interconnection, for me, made during the creative process of engaging with the material, we are simultaneously evolving together and knowledge is being transferred. So even if I was working with a rock knows way better how to be a rock than me. So there's learning there. And if we look at a belonging, an object, a form, the material as part of us, that it is too made of the same as us, not separate, not something we're simply making or giving form to, that we will forever have invisible connections to. It is a two-way learning. The material is teaching us too. Then we can start to have like a deeper relationship and connection to materials. So I guess what I'm saying more simply is it's more than just matter and form. It's connections, patterns, and relationships that are developed over deep time. So for mob, our DNA is often embedded within our making. Our person becomes part of our materiality. We can make from the body, like hair string, and our environment as well as, and these are thoughtful and sensitive. So there's no waste. We make canoes so that we don't kill the tree. We, take animal. We don't take mothers with their babies. We let them free. We design systems so that mobs down the river will still have plenty. We're aware of the intention of making and magic that is held within belongings and materials. So every time that we take from the world around us, we need to think about the multitude of relationships, connections, and patterns that that material will affect. There are many layers to each and every project, but everything is kept in check by what I call my radar. So my radar is a place in my body, and it's just sort of centered just below my diaphragm there in my gut. And it's what keeps me on track and makes sure that everything is going properly. And by properly, I mean making sure that the old people, the elders, the community, the plants, the animals, and the earth are all good. Nothing is overlooked or undervalued, and everything is right. And when my radar goes off, it's a good thing, because it usually means that something requires my attention or something isn't feeling right. And it makes sure that I'm always learning and that every project is coming together with respect and understanding. So I think I missed a page. Yeah, there we go. So I wanted to give you an example of what this looks like, because it's give it a bit of context. So this is the case study I've just put together real quick. It's called Birul Namana, which means eating together. This was an intergenerational collaboration with my family, with my mother, Janine Boree, my father, Ron Boree, my then partner, and my son, Yara Monks. It was commissioned by Linda New Art as part of the Design Fringe 2021, and which addressed the theme of home. It's made from grass tree resin, kangaroo scat and teeth, charcoal, driftwood, river reed, shell, acacia, human hair, echidna quill, and eucalyptus. The dimensions are variable. The work was made with family on Yamaji country, the country my ancestors have belonged to since the beginning of time. On Yamaji country, you're surrounded by an abundant environment full of natural materials that mob have worked with since the beginning of time. On country, natural materials are resources for crafting belongings, but they also hold stories of cultural knowledge shared throughout generations, ceremonies, and geographies of time and space. Through combining locally abundant materials like grass tree resin exposed by cultural burns, kangaroo scat, and charcoal, we're able to create a thermoplastic fiberglass. So this is made by the kangaroo scat creating a mesh-like substance, because it is just purely grass fiber. And then the charcoal mixed in there on a very microscopic scale is like a hollow tube, and it then evenly spreads the heat. And then the resin, which basically like explodes out of the grass tree and into just little balls on the side or on the sand, is actually a thermoplastic. So when that's reheated, it can be remolded. And if you combine all those together, yeah, it's like a fiberglass. So it's very, like, the technology is quite amazing, that's gone into the learning of understanding material in these kind of senses. So with that in mind, I created sort of multi-purpose utilitarian items for like domestic use within my home. So the things I was considering was, could this material and connection be integrated into my home? Could I keep my connection to country and express my culture and belonging within my belongings? I am of mixed heritage of both First Nations and colonizers living on unceded land. So how could I bring this lived experience together as part of my home. So whilst on Yamaji country, I was considering these complex stories behind these traditional materials and what transformed into everyday sacred cultural belongings over such a long time. These materials connect us to nature and to each other. The rituals surrounding their manufacturing, the collecting and foraging, the seasonal relocation of mob, the particular smells of a region, and what creates a home. The cultural burns that would expose the grass tree resin, the grinding and combining of the dried kangaroo scat and charcoal, chemically and mechanically engineering this thermoplastic fiberglass while sitting by the fire, rolling, pressing, building, learning, and transferring knowledge, and the transfer of knowledge into the creation of a thriving lifestyle and connected community. How the materiality of an object was the starting point for it stretching out into these deeper facets of cultural upkeep. So the project was discussed and supported with my elders. I had yarns with family, and as the work developed, things just happened. I knew when we found kangaroo bones, I was on the right track. When we stumbled across grass tree forest with my son, when a fellow friend and artist was working with resin and could tell me how to build with it, my knowledge and understanding just grew. When we went on a holiday and a cyclone had just brought in the large shells onto the beach we visited, when we found an echidna on the side of the road, and as the artwork unfolded, the materials required to make the work appeared. And this is how I knew with my radar that we were on the right track. So the bowl was actually one of the most difficult things and materials I have ever worked with. So I learned an absolute ton. It can be remelted, reworked, it can be overcooked, it smells, it built my patience, it made me go to country with my family, and I learned about making over a long period of time and on the move. This material usually had a base, and so it was worked upon this layer. So it was a long journey of discovery, and I had a lot of burnt fingertips during the process. But for me, it was also really interesting because it made me think about the future as well, and 3D resin in a 3D printer, and that would be a really interesting development possibly into the future. So if anybody knows anybody, that would be great. So just to reiterate, the starting point or way I like to approach my designs is with a story or meaning or purpose to generate a conversation or connection. The story is always unique and front of mind. Everyone has their own story, and I find this the most exciting and interesting place to begin. The story dictates how the object or belonging will evolve. I'm not particularly concerned about Western fundamentals of design, such as balance, contrast, repetition, or proportion, etc. These are all secondary to me, and in the conceptual stage, I can find them a little bit of a hindrance. What I do have is my radar and a total understanding that the end result will be something hopefully aesthetically pleasing, and it will be connected to story and people, and one that considers the materiality as part of the journey. How am I going for time?
Yes, I think you're okay. Yeah.
I've got more. Okay, keep going.
I can't remember, Ollie, when we actually started, but yes.
Started about 10
Okay.
times.
All
Yeah,
right.
5 more
What's
minutes.
the time now?
5 more minutes.
Okay. Oh, great. Okay, great. All right. So I just thought I would share another story with you because there's different ways that these things kind of unfold. So this was a project called Malu. And the intention with this project was intergenerational and DNA sort of knowledge transfer. My great-great-grandmother, Laurie, is no longer with us in the physical form, but her spirit is within me and she's in my bones, and I'm connected to her and all of my ancestors as they have made me who I am today. And I'm sure that this is actually who kept my radar and checked most of the time. So this is an example of what has come from a story this story originally came from Auntie Dora Dan, who's written some amazing books on Yamaji Bush Tucker, and she is my great Granny Laurie's niece. So I went to visit her in Geraldton, and she was reminiscing about Granny Laurie's kangaroo tail stew, which had been written up in a book, The Road to the Murchison. Anyhow, she was talking about how lovely it was, and everybody knew her and how special she was at this dish. And I was thinking how nice it would be to sort of recreate this recipe in her honor, but I'm like a terrible cook. So I thought, how can I share this story using my design skills? And so I decided to make a range of furniture. And it was about telling like the whole story, so connected to making the kangaroo tail stew. So the life force of the kangaroo, the hunter who caught the kangaroo, and then the coming together of community to eat the kangaroo tail stew. So the first chair, which is this one on the screen right now, was to represent the kangaroo, or wobbin wobbin, which means bounce of the kangaroo itself. So when I designed this piece, I was pregnant at the time. I wanted to express the loving and nurturing qualities of the kangaroo and the pouch. So I made a chair that you could literally wrap yourself in the kangaroo skin. The blanket actually comes around the side, and I'd also had the sort of appearance of a bouncer. There was what I call sort of the warrior chair, or wobbin, which is which is the boomerang chair. And this chair was brave and innovative and proud, and it was like sitting in a throne. It sort of contained power. And then the third piece was about representing the community coming together, Ninjana, which is sitting together. And this was a set of 6 stools around a table, and it was set slightly lower than usual to the ground. And in the center was placed lamandra for weaving, and also wild wallaby yarn for knitting. It was to bring everyone together as a community to share and transfer knowledge. So to keep my radar on track the whole time, it was about the connection, the pattern, the relationships. And so it wasn't just about a piece of furniture, it was about the feeling that you gained when you experienced the chair. So when people would sit in the kangaroo chair, they'd be like, oh, I just feel like I'm getting a nice big hug, you know, and that's exactly the feeling that I wanted people to have, that they felt super nurtured and comforted, and it was really nice. And then when they sit in the warrior chair, the hunter chair, they're like empowered and feel strong. And then this last set, which was about coming together, people would sit there and it was just a little bit lower so people could walk around, but you felt like you were sort of in your own little bubble, and everyone that was on those chairs really started to create their own little community there and was sharing and talking. So they all kind of embedded the feelings that I wanted them to, more than the material or the aesthetic. But the materials were all selected to have a connection to country, the kangaroos, the gold, and like the silver, like we have all of those materials on country, and we used all native timbers, although the timbers were from Tasmania. We couldn't get them from Western Australia. So everything is thought about. And it's the same with my art practice. So those are sort of some design projects. And so I thought I would just show you a little video about a time that I had out on Barkindji country when I found myself in an environment that had parallels to my country. So it was like sheep farming was introduced there, and there was large areas of sort of fenced off to the native animals. When I went there, there was a car had hit an emu not long before, and all of the feathers were up the road. And it was sort of a bit of a senseless death, ultimately caused by the, process of colonization. And then when I went to the sheep station in there, there was some discarded wool. And I really felt this divide within myself, being, English and Dutch, and also Aboriginal, there was a big divide, and I felt really uncomfortableness in my skin. And that's what Shimu was created from, this kind of jamming together or trying to sort of understand who I was and my identity. And so when the sheep and the emu come together, they kind of create this unrecognizable creature. So I have a little video that I'll just show real quick.
I always think the old people are watching us in a really nurturing way, and if we let them guide us, what is meant to happen will happen. It's about connecting communities, it's about connecting people, it's about connecting us with the animals, with the earth, with the plants, with the old people. There's so many different layers and so many unseen layers that I like to respond to as well. I am part Aboriginal, Dutch and English. I come from a mixed background, but that's who I am. And how do I, represent that? I just feel like it's a bit jammed together, and I don't really understand where my identity fits into today. These two materials of animals, one emu feathers and one wool, one was a native animal and one was this introduced animal. I just joined them together and made this new unidentifiable creature. I spent about 5 days just weaving and making and sewing. It's not really a costume, but I call it the Shimu. It has its own name, and then the performance has its name as well. The work is called We Are All Animals. So the movements and things that I do with it are very much about creating a nest and creating a home. It's about connecting back to the fact that we are just animals. Western ideology is about separating ourselves from our environment. There's this quite definite hierarchy. Well, I just wanted to bring myself back down and say, hey, in the end, we're all just animals.
Thanks so much, Nicole. That's wonderful. So Peter Sharp's research over 30 years has consistently been about the visual exploration and understanding of how nature works and fits together through the lens of abstraction. Sydney-based, Peter has held solo exhibitions since 1989 in Sydney, Newcastle, Canberra, Melbourne, and internationally in Germany. His work has been included in group exhibitions since 1987 throughout Australia and internationally in Paris, Chiang Mai, Beijing, and London. In 2001, Peter participated in the award-winning television documentary 2/3 Sky, which culminated in an exhibition of the same title held at the Hazelhurst Regional Gallery and Arts Centre. In 2012, Peter held his first survey at Hazelhurst Regional Gallery and Arts Centre titled Peter Sharp Will to Form, curated by Lise Noel, and featured works from a 15-year period. In 2014, Peter was part of the first Dobell Drawing Biennale at the Art Gallery of New South Wales that explored how artists use drawing as a way of understanding the Australian landscape. In 2021, a 30-year survey of plein air painting titled Accidental Tourist was held at Manly Museum and Art Gallery, which then toured to Shoalhaven Gallery in Nowra, Jervis Bay Maritime Museum in Huskisson, and finally to Nicholas Thompson Gallery in Melbourne in 2023. Peter's work is held in many public and private collections, including the National Gallery of Australia and the Art Gallery of New South Wales. Peter is a senior lecturer at UNSW Art and Design and is represented by Liverpool Street Gallery in Sydney and Nicholas Thompson Gallery in Melbourne. Welcome, Peter.
Wow, we should all have a lie down after that. Thanks. I'd like to acknowledge Nicole to First Nations people who are here and First Nations people who aren't here at the moment. And Nicole, I'd loved seeing Shimu again. So thank you for including that.
I just realised I totally should have done a shout out to you during that one then, because that was when Peter went out to what was the name of the place?
Fowler's Gap Research Station.
Fowler's Gap. It is Fowler's Gap. Yeah, when we went out there and together, and it was just so transformational for me. So thank you, Peter.
No, it was great. It was really lovely to see it again. I mean, it's a really lovely place to start too, because I'm going to make comment about what Nicole said about separation from land. And when I went to art school, I knew that I had a content to sort of play with, which was about nature and land, but I had to find a way in. And when Nicole talked about, just at the end of her talk about being separated from land, my whole practice is trying to find some kind of connection with it. And I was trained at COFA, which started off at Alexander Mackie a million years ago, in a kind of white, Western, modernist tradition of painting and drawing. And what made a huge difference to me in my way of understanding my place in the world was Aboriginal painting. When I first started looking at that, and it was early 90s, and one of the first shows I saw was Emily Angwari at Coventry Gallery. I think it was about 1989. And I had no way into understanding this work, but I knew the work was really important. And Aboriginal painting is probably the greatest art movement to come out of Australia. And I love telling people that. I love people arguing with me about that. So I want to firstly ground that. So my journey, and I love the idea, second thing I'd like to acknowledge is Zoe for bringing up the idea of a forum about materiality, because as I said, I tend to have a content, which is nature and different facets of that, and then I run it through different kinds of materials. So here we go. First thing I've got here is a bunch of drawings that I make. It all comes from looking at things outside. The drawings might then get manipulated, and I use them as diagrams to make other work. So the drawings are a kind of plan. And the thing I'm fascinated with still with these drawings is I don't think a lot when I'm outside walking around through bush, through country. I just draw stuff and I just let it come to me. And then I put the drawings up in the studio and see what they bring. The material especially is important because it's soft compressed charcoal. And what I like about that is that I can't always predict what it's going to do. So it acts as a kind of disruption. And then I can actually use that for it to show me different ways of seeing and feeling about nature. No, it's not going to let me go on. Let's see if that does it. Yes, right. So the drawings came first because after engaging with Aboriginal painting, I was trying to come up with other ways of seeing and feeling about place, right? So it was about being immersed. And I like what Nicole said too about being in the landscape as well. And I'm still trying to find ways of doing that. And I've grown up on the coast. And so I've been involved in kind of coast culture, surfing, fishing, walking around that place, especially Sutherland Shire and Guigal country since I was born. So this painting is especially important to me because it's a story about whales. And when I was younger, gosh, it'd be 25, 30 years ago, I got the chance to actually swim with whales in Cronulla Bay. And it was the most amazing thing because these animals are huge, absolutely huge, really silent. And I'm underwater with a humpback whale and her calf. And so the idea was, how do you then make work that talks about the immensity of the place and the experience? So this painting is 2 meters by about 2.5 meters, and it's got acrylic underpainting, and those kind of shapes in there come from whale bones that I originally drew down Western Australia, down the whaling station at Albany. So I actually drew from whales that had actually been taken out of the ocean and chopped up. And so I actually was trying to make some kind of salvation of what was left there. So the bones are in the background, acrylic, then it's got oil glazes over the top. And again, back to the materiality of this, the oil glazes act like a giant watercolor. So the thing is actually painted on the floor. And I love the feeling of this painting. And that's why it's important, because you feel like you're immersed in something, and trying to eliminate foreground, midground, background, which kind of is a white tradition and works really well as long as you don't move. And so I've got issues with that idea of foreground, background in paintings. So this painting was really important because it gave me a way into thinking about how to be immersed in land and the environment. So continuing on, I tend to find something that I'm interested in the landscape. And currently the theme through this talk is about water and coast. So this is more about practice that I'm doing now for the last 2 or 3 years. The whale painting was from the early 2000s, where this work now is probably from the last 4 or 5 years. So these are drawings, charcoal drawings on A4 sheets of paper, soft compressed charcoal, and it's walking along coastal zones, beaches, rock pools, and just finding things that are actually there. And I don't know if I've solved this visual problem yet, but if anyone thinks of beach or coastline, there's that white tradition of, it's almost like a cliche of going to the beach, and lots of people have dealt with beach, and I'm trying to find another way into talking about my experience of that. So just drawing things, this is pig face plants, kelp, seaweed, little snails that have sort of lying around. So just draw them, and then trying to find some way to actually make paintings from them that talk about my experience of that. The color in these, pink and gray, actually comes from the flowers, from the pig face. So the form and the diagram or the drawing of it actually is reminiscent of the actual thing, and so is the color. But what I do is pull it apart and put it back together again to try and come up with a kind of new solution. So have I arrived yet? Don't know, but look, we'll see. And this was a show that had some of those pictures. So if you think, you can see the drawing, you can see the shape of these leaves with shadows on them, then you can see that translate to the forms in the painting, which are linen that I've glued onto marine ply. I love this too, because the fact that the oil paint will soak into it, I can't predict what it's doing. So again, it's trying to use materials as a disruptor or something to amplify what the materials can do and help the content, if that makes sense. 2021, so jumped a long way from that first whale painting. These are the pictures that it came up with. They're, what are they, 75 by 60 centimeters. And that sculpture, I purposely put in as a kind of disruptor too, because if we walk along the coastline now, especially where I live, there's as much man-made items, plastics, driftwood, washing up on the beach as there is natural items. So I wanted to kind of acknowledge that. So there's bits and pieces of found objects, natural objects, and man-made objects. And this things like could be a trig station or a buoy, and it's got metal frame, it's got found timber, and it's got sawn timber as well. The only trouble with this whole show was it was open for 3 days and got locked down and no one saw it. 2 years worth of work. So that's why I'm showing it now, so people can actually see it. So great. This is one of the pictures that was in that show. The background acrylic underpainting, which is black on linen board again, is a piece of driftwood, like a chock that goes, driftwood as in man-made, off a freight ship that's fallen in the ocean, been weathered, becomes really bleached, washed up on the beach, and then I'm repurposing the shape of it as a background, and then I'm putting these other more formal shapes over the top. This is called offshore. The next one's called onshore. So I'm playing around with atmospheres and what actually happens and feelings and things that you experience on the beach. And again, trying to eliminate, or not eliminate, but deal with land and the idea of place in different ways and find my own kind of language with it. Here's another picture of a show from 2019. And often what will happen, I'll get a story, a content, and I'll put it through, I was talking about different materials. In this case, what I did was there's found timber on stands I really enjoyed the process, and I like Nicole talking about this too, working with other people, because making art, you know, can be quite a lonely idea and process. But I worked with a fitter and turner mate, and we actually made these stands in situ and put these found objects on top of them, which remind me of beach, which remind me of driftwood and remind me of found objects. And I particularly like if anyone can see that pole and that little hill that's in the background leaning on the corner, it was my little witty, I don't know if it's witty, but I just called it hill. So I actually made this little prop as a hill and just put it in the corner. And everyone came in and looked at it and looked at me, and they had these conversations about the way we actually read land and read landscape. So I particularly like this group of sculptures. The painting that's hanging on the wall is 152 by about 130 centimeters, and the sculptures are all relatable to human size. This is current work. This is something that's actually happening right now. You know, studio space, as we all know, is hard to come by. Sydney especially, you know, just living here is difficult. So when Carrie Kibler of Hazelhurst Regional Gallery said, look, if we just give you a space and you find some timber and then you become the exhibit. So I'm trying to make things out of this fallen found timber, 4 ton of Norfolk pine, and it's got yellow box eucalypt. So they're trees that have been felled. It was pretty funny because the truck just came up and dumped this stuff. They put a fence around it and they just said, go at it. And so for the last 4 months, I've been making things from the timber. And again, the materials, this is why it was really lovely that Zoe brought this forum for us to actually participate in, because the material, I go up there and I basically have no idea in my head what I'm going to make. I have a history of putting things together. I treat it like blocks, giant Lego, and I just cut these shapes up. And what I'm trying to do is pay homage to the material. So there's been lots of conversations about the actual kind of trees it is. And Norfolk pine, you know, if you talk about Botany Bay, those really tall pine trees, it's not endemic. It's actually been introduced from Norfolk Island. So it talks about what is here, what shouldn't be here, what's endemic, what's not. And the conversations as a material have been absolutely amazing, because what can I tell as an example? There was one guy who was Russian, who lives here in Australia, citizenship, and he had this long conversation with me about his mother, who was trapped in the Ukraine at the moment. It was actually a sculptor and made things. So because I'm in this park at Hazelhurst, I end up having these fantastic conversations. So I actually think the conversations in some ways have been more important than the actual making of the sculpture. I don't know what's going to happen to them at the end, which is really interesting. It's funny, I need more help to actually roll these timbers around. So everything again is related to human size. So I can actually make these things, and they're only held together by leverage and gravity. So what I think is really funny is they fall over. If a southerly comes through, they just fall over, and the curator gets really upset, and I just go up there and put them all together. Wonderful conversations with kids too about giant Lego. There's also a nod here to Aboriginal sculpture as well. Make do things, being left alone, really simplified, totem-like looks. I want to make that clear as well. Finally, current work, back to the beach and water theme. This is a really interesting one because I don't know how I feel about this work at the moment, but this is like my secret project. I'm actually walking into the surf at different places, and I'm using a spray can to, once I walk into the surf, the water hits a piece of watercolor paper, A3 or A4, and then what I'm using is a spray can to actually spray on the splash of the water. So what's happening is the water's becoming like a print. It's a fingerprint of my action with the ocean. And I think this stuff is amazing. It's almost like marbling, but it's actually an indexical thing. The ocean is hitting this thing and leaving this print. And I love the idea of, is it abstraction or is it realism? And for me, it's probably more real because I have to be there. And if I look at these things, it takes me straight back to where I was. This is Burgess Beach, Foster. This is the 21st of February. And I've made these drawings or prints, but the materiality of finding a way to use, industrial spray can to actually have direction, motion, and impact of the ocean, I think there's something there. Don't really know where it's going, but we'll see. Can I see it as a finished work? I don't know. Someone can tell me in question time. That's a little bit bigger than between A4 and A3 sheets of watercolor paper with enamel spray on it that's been interrupted by splashing ocean. Current drawings, again, has some of those splash drawings in it. And I love the idea of this being more about how I would argue that we walk through place and land, in that you take a more staccato view of different things rather than long view or mid-ground, foreground, background view. And then finally, that's the studio. That's what I'm working on. I thought it'd be quite interesting just to put that in. So there's current paintings. I don't know if they work, but everything on the wall becomes fodder, becomes, information that goes in the paintings, sculptures and drawings. So just to reiterate, I tend to have a content, and then what I do is I run that content through different kinds of materiality and see where it goes. So stay tuned, guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. That's fantastic. And yes, I've been wondering how you've been going with your big sections of timber of Norfolk pine. So yeah, lovely to see that evolving. Okie dokie, we'll move on now to Consuelo. So while you're setting up, Consuelo, I'll introduce you. That's okay. So Consuelo is an interdisciplinary artist whose work focuses on how we see and understand space. Her work often employs technically simple effects to distort perception and unsettle the relationship between viewer and space. Independent curatorial projects have consistently flanked Consuelo's practice. She has developed a range of exhibitions, including a major program of ephemeral artworks in public spaces, and is co-founder of experimental art space Sydenham International and Cut and Polish art car boot sale presented at Carriage Works. Consuelo is the recipient of the inaugural River Capital Commission at Gertrude Contemporary with Brendan Van Heck in 2019, the inaugural McFarlane Commission at the Australian Centre for Contemporary Art in 2018, and the 2016 Create New South Wales Visual Art Fellowship for Emerging Practitioners. She has undertaken residencies at Ness, Iceland, and in the Pilbara in WA through Form. She has exhibited widely nationally. Consuelo is a casual academic in the Faculty of Architecture at University of Sydney for over 9 years, and currently Associate Lecturer at UNSW Art and Design. Welcome, Consuelo.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And thank you, echoing Pete's thanks. Thank you for setting this up and for bringing us together to talk about materiality and to have a conversation amongst practitioners. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which I'm joining, which is the lands of the Gadigal and Bidjigal people of the Eora Nations, where I live and work currently. I am going to talk about materiality through an investigation of space. So I look at space in terms of our perception and understanding of space and ourselves and our roles within sort of understanding space through our position within it. And also consider space in terms of architectural space. So I'm looking at a constructed space, both in terms of it being physically constructed and socially and culturally constructed. So sort of dealing with spaces in a number of different ways. A lot of it is tied to the idea of the domestic space. So I'm looking at spaces in connection to walls and floors and windows and doors and openings and areas of transition between internal and external space. And that will hopefully come up through the works that I'm going to show. I'm going to go through a bunch of different works. So I'm just sort of touching on a few different things in relation to materials, but also processes and the types of things that it can lead to. And I had those keywords and ideas in the first slide just to sort of orientate the types of things that I'm interested in and the conversation. So I'm going to start with this project, which was presented at PICA in Perth, and I lived for most of my life, for a lot of my life in Perth. So I'm really connected to a lot of the spaces there. And it was important for me to come to show this work in PICA, also because I'd had a really long history with the space. So to come back into this space and be able to respond to it with an exhibition was really great for me. I'd worked as an installer in this space and as, in a bunch of different roles at PICA. So the connection to specific spaces is also important to the way that I work. This work was also developed in 2015 in the middle of my master's course. So I was studying at SCA, and this really triggered off a whole bunch of stuff for me that is still sort of affecting the way that I work. So the pieces are made of acrylic. They're about 1700 high. So I generally make work that is my height. So it's in relation to the body in space, the sculptures in space, and the relationship between sculpture, body, and the space that they're in. The work for the first time dealt with, actually used the lighting within the gallery as well. So this was just gallery lighting, but it really sort of activated the space, the materials. And one of the things that I created here in that idea of perception and understanding of ourselves in space is that really created a sense of disorientation and confusion. So you couldn't approach the works with any sense of, I know what they are and what they do, because you couldn't tell what was actual material and what was a reflection or a projection. As a result, a bunch of people actually walked into the sculptures during the course of the exhibition, but this kind of sense of having to reorientate yourself around these works. And one of the things that I did in this project as well is that I thought about the way that the audience was active within this space. So I was thinking about the idea of performativity of the material. So thinking about how can I activate materials and what circumstances can I set up for the material to perform, to sort of perform itself. And considering the way that this acrylic did all the things that it does, it created reflections and had transparency, of course, made me go back to that idea of plate glass, and glass as something that is that the original sort of mystery of plate glass that people like Ms. van der Rohe talk about, that it is both transparent and reflective, and sort of bringing this into these works as well. And in the installation also, the audience was really active. So there wasn't a single space from which you could view the work. It sort of encouraged or led you to move through the work, so that the audience was really active within it. But as always, as I continue to sort of ask, you know, I was dealing with plastics. I was dealing with perspex, and I wasn't sure about it. I'm still not sure about it. I haven't used it any longer, except for the plastics that I still have in the studio now. So I'm thinking about my responsibility as a maker, as a person who deals with materials, and I instinctively work with materials, and I am a maker in my practice. So I keep sort of returning to making stuff. So I keep asking myself, how do I deal with the things that I make and the things that I put into the world and the things that I rearrange, the materials that I find? I don't have an answer with it. Sometimes I kind of get myself into a tangle around those things, and other times I feel like I'm okay with the types of things that I'm touching and that I'm engaging with. but one of the things that question kind of led me to is to working with glass rather than plastics. So not that glass is uncomplicated in terms of the way that it's made, because it uses a lot of energy, but there's something about the circularity of glass that is better than plastics environmentally. So this is a project that I staged in Accra. It was part of a fellowship exhibition, a group exhibition. And this is where I was actually able to not deal with, so in the previous work, it was a notional movement in the work, and this time it was actual movement. So here, everything was active. There was active lights, there was active audience members, and the objects within the work also moved. So I was thinking about this idea of materiality as something that is, or materials as something that is unfixed, things that are actually active within the space, but in terms of movement in it. And through the work, I was dealing with the idea of the frame, the act of looking through something, looking through a filter, or looking through something that is both a frame and a filter, the way that color can affect our vision, the way that an atmosphere is constructed. So I was thinking about that when Pete, you were talking about the idea of atmospheres. I was thinking about the way that I sort of deal with atmospheres within the work as well, and try and activate atmosphere within a space. In the work, I think about this idea of, again, of the reflection and the transparency. So going to a quote by architect Beatrice Colomina, who deals with Dane Graham's work, she talks about the work as, in a sense, all of Graham's pavilions play on the original surprise of glass architecture, endlessly exploring the enigma that glass is not actually transparent. But it takes Mies, and that's Mies van der Rohe, of course, quests into another dimension, seeing the play of reflection in psychological, sexual, and economic terms. He forces the viewer to become implicated in these questions. So I'm sort of thinking about the role of the viewer within these things. So if things move, how do we reposition ourselves within space? And one of the things that is important for me as well is to think about, if things are unfixed, to also talk about the intangible as well as the tangible. So in this project, as I said previously, I was able to use light a little bit more in a more concerted way. I had stage lighting instead of gallery lighting, and the lighting was something that that really became part of the work, and also led people to move these panels around the space. And these panels were quite large. They were 2 by 2 meters, so quite architectural in scale as well. Working with light was a shift for me, because it made me have to deal with a score, like a lighting score. I hadn't worked in this way before. So it shifted the way that I had to arrange both time in relation to the material and movement in relation to this intangible material. So it was an interesting shift for me. And one of the ways that I work as well is that I always make maquettes or models, because I need to see things physically in space. So how do we, so this was a sort of a slightly shrunken version of these panels that I had in my studio. I presented them to a crit group that I was running at the time. So brought people into the space to respond, to move around them, to see their bodies moving around these forms, and to think about, how does this glass perform? How does this material perform? What happens when I look through, or what happens when light strikes it? What happens when they move in relation to one another? So really testing them in space. And I always make maquettes of everything, because I need to sort of understand them physically in relation to myself and my actions and other people's actions around them. I also test things through just collecting samples of things, understanding them by looking at them. I can't kind of almost understand a material until I'm touching it and I'm seeing how it performs in space and in relation to the things that are happening in space, such as light and so on. Lighting is, color is something that always comes into the way that I work as well. So this was a project, and maybe one of the things that really shows this idea of the this intangible material of light and how it affects a space, but also everything that's in it. So this was a project that I did collaboratively with Brendan Van Heck at Gertrude, and this is the Gertrude space that is set up as these two spaces. So one side we had yellow light and the other side we had pink light. And I was thinking about the way that the eye behaves in relation to light as well. So the way that the human eye works in relation to color, and how we can affect the viewer in the space and the way the viewer perceives the space through this kind of immersion into a color. And again, working with something intangible. And in relation to this, I also started working with, or just touching on materiality in relation to sound. So I had the opportunity to go and work with an experimental musician, Robin Hayward, in Berlin for a very short amount of time. But through this, we were looking at both color and material in relation to sound. And he was producing sounds in relation to both, and that we were projecting them or sort of hitting the materials with sound through directional speakers and bouncing the sound off these materials. And one of the things that this did is that it really opened up, that's Robin there, it really opened up the way that I thought about materials through something different, something that I'm not familiar with. I don't ever work with sound. And like, for example, this object on the, this kind of silvery object, this steel mesh, he described as being acoustically transparent. And that to me was amazing, to think about something that was visually visible, but acoustically there was a transparency to it, and it made me think about materials in a different way. I haven't done anything more with it, but it stayed with me as a grain of something to return to as a way of engaging with materials and also with engaging with forms. In this idea of the intangible, I also think about it in terms of the actual processes within my making. So drawing is a really big part of how I work. I sort of think through forms and think through spaces through drawing. And I work with airbrushing. So this is an airbrush drawing. And I think about the connection of airbrushing to this idea of the intangible, because when I airbrush, I don't touch the paper, I don't touch anything. It's basically like ink flying through air and hitting something, but I don't actually touch it. So this kind of connection of the process in relation to the materials and the ideas that is really important as a way of working as well. I wanted to also just think about space in relation, like space as a material, and thinking about how you can affect a material, affect space. And through this couple of works, I was thinking about the idea of sort of repositioning or carving into a space, not through the material, but actually dealing with the space almost as a material. So this was a really simple intervention of painting edges on a wall in a gallery and making it feel like the entire thing had shifted or tilted, but physically nothing had actually happened. So again, it's almost notional. And similarly, in this little project at 55 Sydenham, I painted on the wall as if I were cutting through the space. But similar, like distinctly from, you know, somebody like Gordon Matter-Clark, who actually goes at the space and cuts into it. This is a notional cut, a sort of a repositioning, restructuring, and a kind of a, but thinking still of space as a kind of a material that you can kind of affect in some way. And I'm going to go back to undergrad. This is a project that I did in second year. And in this idea of sort of reorganizing materials. So in thinking about surfaces and structures and the relationship between them, in this project, I took up the carpet underlay in my rental, the house that I was renting, the apartment that I was renting, and I took things from underside, from underneath, from behind, and made them invade the space. So thinking about how our position in space might have been affected by the way that you can kind of, you know, shift things around within the space. So the underlay ended up filling the points of access And in this other work, I took these structural timbers and made them kind of explode out into the space, and reverting the order of the things within the space. So from behind to filling the space. So the space actually ended up becoming something that was non-functional. I'm just conscious of time. A couple of things to go to look at as well. Well, thinking about this kind of material from the space itself. So working with the carpet underlay, working with structural timbers in the domestic space when I was dealing with the idea of space, particularly tied to the domestic in undergrad. This is a work that I did where I was thinking about what would happen if the space were to shed its skin. And if it were to sort of just to shed its skin. So I was thinking about skins and surfaces and facades of skin. So this is a really thin ply. So the material again is something that could potentially come from the structure, from the architecture. It's a material of architectural language. And it's super thin ply that I just allowed to drop into the space. I hinged it and allowed it to drop and just sort of spread across the space. So another way of dealing with materials that I kind of work with is just letting the material do what it does. These, for example, are just sheets of acrylic, again, back to the acrylic, that I just punched a hole in and suspended. So the material is both flexible, so there's this drooping onto the ground, but it's also transparent. And so you get this layering of the colors as if there was a sort of color mixing in space. And similarly, going into felt, how do you, going back to the question of how can you activate the material? What kinds of things can you set up by cutting, by dropping, by suspending, working with gravity to allow the material to do what it does, the performativity of the material in some ways, going back to that question. And the potential of all of these types of things. So what if I was to cut it in this way? What if I was to think about the idea of an opening of a frame again, but through a softness now, through this softness of materials? And so these three works are called soft openings, untitled soft openings. Challenge of the material. When I work with transparent and reflective material, it's really hard to document it. So people who have encountered my work in the flesh have often said to me, oh, wow, your work is actually really interesting. Surprise, because in the documentation it doesn't look like anything. Often the material is really, or the documentation is really dead and flat. And so I go to Dan Graham again, because he talks about the way that you can include, like the documentation can allow the material to show how it performs. So looking at the relationship with the materials, this transparency and reflectivity with a person, documenting it to try and show how it behaves if you were to encounter it in person. And the person, of course, is always part of the work, especially when you deal with reflective materials. The viewer is always implicated in the work. And I always think about the work as being something quite dormant almost until the surface is activated by the viewer. And the viewer in these works is always kind of, again, in that thinking of the viewer in the space. The reflective and transparent material allow the viewer, and the way that I angle the materials, the viewer is either cut or displaced, or sometimes also just like removed in parts. And here I was testing this idea of how to document things with Christian Capurro, an artist and a photographer, through the work in ACCA. What if I put things through it? What are these frames? What are this kind of act of looking through? And how do I actually document the work so that this understanding of the space can be transmitted through the documentation itself? Finally, working with plate glass led me to being invited to do a residency in Canberra Glassworks, which was supposed to happen earlier, but COVID got in the way. And so it actually happened at the beginning of last year. And this was a real turnaround for me. Or not turnaround, but it's just opened up a whole different direction. So plate glass and float glass is something that I've worked with, but actually getting it cut and manipulated often by a manufacturer. I don't really use, handle it myself. Whereas with handmade glass, everything changed. But the understanding of color and the understanding of transparency and opacity that I guess learned from other materials and usage of materials came into this work. But the material asks for different things, and it really asks for a stepped approach. You have to respect the way that the glass asks to be worked with. I had to learn a whole lot of processes. The processes themselves sort of gave me an introduction into other ideas. So the materials generated ideas for me about space. I had to slow down because you need to test things and you need to go through a series of steps to be able to produce the glass, both in kiln formed glass, and then when I took it into the hot shop as well. And in a hot shop, I don't have the skills to make the work myself, so I had to hand that over to somebody else. And the collaborative way of working in a hot shop is really exciting for me. Also, the heat, the sort of collaboration between handling these objects and handing them from one person to another has really opened things up for me. So out of this initial just kind of dipping my toe really into working with handmade glass, I produced these works that again are about perception, color mixing in space through these smaller forms, this idea of layering and about the way that we see things depending on where we stand. And then this work through UNSW galleries in the middle of last year that brought around, again, these are sort of my height. So they're these sort of figures in space in some ways, but they're still talking about doors and openings and looking through something and projections and reflections and layering of color. And then finally, this work that I just started touching on, which is glass as well, that I deals with this idea of layering of color and also framing that was presented at Heidi as part of the group show whole. That makes me deal with this, that led me to deal with textured glass and chunky glass called frit. I'm not sure where it's going, but I'm incredibly drawn to it. It's kind of ugly and attractive at the same time. And this is, again, it sort of presents an approach to glass that is not about transparency this time. It's actually about opacity and about texture. And so this is where I'll finish up, but it's it's just, for me, it's just opened up a whole bunch of really interesting potentials around this new way of dealing with handmade glass as a material that I know, but it's so different to deal with in the handmade as opposed to industrially produced nature. Thank you.
Thanks, Consuelo. That was wonderful. So Matt Harkness is an early career designer, researcher, and academic based in Sydney, Australia. He focuses on non-traditional research outcomes and specialises in object design from critical making, speculative, co-design, and more than human perspectives. Matt's research draws on these to interrogate the ethics of making, specifically wasteful, exclusive, and exploitative maker practices. Through material experiments, his practice-based research includes waste plastic and bioplastic materials, ceramics, electronics, and repurposed objects. Matt has taught design courses at universities in Australia and Canada and exhibited design works nationally and internationally. He has shown work at the Australian Design Centre, the National Gallery of Victoria, Interiors Australia, Den Fairs, Australia's Next Top Designer, and Dubai Design Week. Welcome, Matthew.
Yeah, thank you, Zoe, for the introduction, and thanks everyone presenting before. I can definitely see a lot of interesting commonalities between our work that we'll have to discuss in the future. So We'll get started. So my name is Matt Harkness, and I just wanted to share some work in progress experiments that I've been doing today that focus on circularity and dissolvable design objects. So just a little bit about me. I'm a recent graduate of the UNSW Art Design PhD program. I've been teaching in design at UNSW for a few years now, and I specialize in furniture and object design from an environmental sustainability and more than human perspective. So some of my research interests include critical making, do-it-yourself or DIY, maker culture, 3D printing, speculative design, and co-design. So let's see if that switches. There we go. So finishing my PhD, which is something that I thought I would never say, I've been reflecting on my experiments and thinking, oh my God, what comes next? So this talk today will highlight some of the work in progress projects I've been doing that build from this previous maker culture, 3D printing, waste, and sustainability focused research. So today's talk involves experiments with circular economy, plastic waste, 3D printing, and dissolvable binder materials. And so as this forum focuses on moving beyond the understanding of designers and makers merely imposing form on materials, my work talks about actor network theory and critical making, and is theoretically underpinned by these. So I'll expand on these shortly, but essentially just drawing from these perspectives in my practice-based research, I aim to move away from this kind of human-centric focus of making and instead acknowledge the contributions that more than humans make in these broader relational networks of design. So the work in progress that I'd like to talk about today is some of these experiments I've been conducting with plastic waste materials and these soluble natural binder materials. These experiments propose this testing of circularity, leveraging new experiments in 3D printing and dissolvable materials that I started to develop in my PhD. So this is kind of building on that. And so these images here are some of the tests that I've been doing with granulated plastic wastes and these various binder materials on the left, and then a 1-to-1 scale 3D printed side table that I made. And this is made with shredded 3D printer waste and xanthan gum. So let me begin just by contextualizing this project. So despite the abundance of plastic in everyday items, plastic and plastic recycling industries globally have failed to develop a circular network of use and reuse, and ultimately to address the polluting impacts of this material on the environment. So for example, in a global analysis of mass-produced plastics in 2017, the world's total plastic production saw 79% of this material disposed of in landfills, 12% of it was incinerated, and only 9% of it ever got recycled. So in terms of landfilling plastic, this material is incredibly robust, and that when it's disposed of in landfills, it impedes different forms of degradation from forces like rain, ultraviolet rays, or bacterial growth. So consequently, we get these plastic materials that don't really degrade, but they only break apart into smaller plastic pieces called microplastics. And then in the meantime, these can leach into and contaminate groundwater. So unsurprisingly, we get this plastic pollution that affects humans and animals. And a well-known example of this, but a thankfully now banned plasticizer that had problems with leaching, was that bisphenol or BPA. So plastic has this really enduring nature, and because of this, it contaminates terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems, as well as every major ocean on the planet. But that enduring nature of plastic is something that I'm hoping to leverage in my work, and I'll expand on that a little bit. So in terms of recycling plastics, one of the reasons that the recycling rate is so low is because it's difficult to differentiate these mixed plastics from one another. It's often not economical to sort them. And so here's some examples of some of my attempts at recycling this plastic on a small scale. This is 3D printer waste I collected from some Sydney-based makerspace workshops, and then some of the various identifiable and unidentifiable materials that I sort of sorted from this, and then I shredded it up and then melted it down into a billet to try to reuse it. So even after this material gets sorted and recycled, recycling is still a really energy-intensive process. And so, again, even when these materials are successfully recycled, they can only be recycled a handful of times. So these materials often start to lose some of their material qualities that make plastics so great. So their durability, their flexibility, and often virgin plastic materials will have to be added to strengthen these materials. So this ultimately maintains our dependence on the production of new plastics. And here's an experiment that I did a few years ago, grinding up this 3D printer waste, melting it and remolding it. And this is the 10th time around in doing this. And so you can see you get this material that's been burned. It's very brittle. It's really discolored. It started out as this nice bright white plastic. It's really discolored now. So as a result of some of this research into plastics and the experiments that I had been conducting previously, it quickly became apparent that recycling plastic is not really the best long-term option for this material. And so some kind of circular alternative kind of system is required. And so something in my work that I wanted to aim to do is to minimize some of this unnecessary heating and cooling of plastic materials and try to reuse it in its kind of current form, even if it's sort of ground up. So thankfully, within the last decade, there's been this push towards circular economy, a lot of interest in it globally to mitigate climate change and other natural resource extraction contingencies like biodiversity loss, pollution, resource depletion, desertification, deforestation, all those kinds of things. So you may have seen this diagram before, but this is a circular economy system. So on the left-hand side, you've got the biological cycle in green, and on the right-hand side, you've got the technical cycle in blue. So you've got biological materials moving through these loops, and these biological materials could be, say, wood materials or food waste, and these are things that are typically biodegradable in nature. And then on the technical side of things, you've got plastics, computer parts, things like that, and these are things that are non-biodegradable, metals, things like that. So as an alternative to the typical linear framework of consumption, so that's the kind of take, make, and then waste framework, you've got objects moving through this circular economy through the technical cycle in these maintenance, repair, reuse, recycling, and remanufacturing loops or cascades. And so within the circular economy, you've got these loops that are kind of larger or smaller. Smaller meaning they use less energy. So something like repair uses less energy, where something like recycling is way on the outside there. And the less energy, the smaller the loop, the more kind of energy that gets conserved overall. So my work with plastics would fit on this technical side, on the blue side, but you could see recycling would be way on that far kind of outer loop. And so that's why it's kind of the last resort. You hear that saying, reduce, reuse, and then recycle. So some of my stuff with this dissolvable materials that sort of sits between the maintain, prolong, and the reuse and redistribute loops. One thing you've probably noticed with this diagram is that it's entirely too neat. In the real world, you have materials and waste streams are quite messy. They're imperfect, they are leaky, they overlap, and they're interconnected. And so here's an example of one of my dissolvable material experiments. And this is with xanthan gum mixed with water and plastic 3D printed waste. But you can see here it started to grow mold on it. It's got these two or maybe even more species of mold. There's kind of like a blue-green mold at the top there and this fuzzy mold. But here you've got these biological and technical cycles crossing over and interacting. And this interconnected aspect of the circular economy system is something that really interests me. So from this, I started to think about how might temporary furniture objects support an exploration into the capacities of transforming materials, circular products, plastic waste, and overall the messiness of the circular economy. So to dig into this messy interconnectedness, I draw on critical making and actor network theory. So critical making is first conceptualized by Matt Ratto in the late 2000s. It's kind of a repoliticization of DIY and maker culture, but it's this process-oriented, hands-on method that unites these typically disconnected modes of engagement. So critical thinking and hands-on making processes. So by bringing these two modes of engagement together, it supports an exploration of some of these more abstract actor network theory concepts in a more approachable way, just fusing these kind of concepts with hands-on making and discussion. So I also draw from actor network theory, and this is to acknowledge and account for the importance of more than humans in networks of design and making and waste. So actor network theory is this approach to socio-technical analysis that treats entities and materialities as enacted and relational. So what that means is Ant understands these social phenomena as these constantly fluctuating webs of relationships between humans and more than human actants, and these webs kind of come together to shape society. And so the term more than human here refers to things like objects, technology, texts, materials, animals, entities, organisms, all these kinds of things. And so actor network theory is also known as a material semiotic method. So material meaning it's between things, and semiotic between these kinds of ideas or concepts. So I'll move on to some more images of these experiments, and then I'll discuss them using some of the Ant concepts, this material semiotic method, to talk about some of the relationships between actants in this network. So this will highlight actor network theory's usefulness when examining maybe how some of these temporary dissolvable furniture objects might influence social phenomena in a circular economy. So right off the bat, I was exploring different binders, different kind of natural soluble binder materials. Some of these are gelatin, glutinous rice flour, agar, tapioca starch, algae, cornstarch, eco, epoxy resin, xanthan gum, all sorts of things. And then so here's an example of part of this workflow. So mixing these granulated waste plastics into a binder, and in this case, it's clay, white stoneware clay, and then loading it into the ceramic 3D printer, and then 3D printing it, and then you've got this kind of finished little vessel prototype there. And so this video illustrates a successful testing of the 3D printed plastic in the xanthan gum, just as a little kind of ring, but you can see this mixture's capability to kind of adhere, to solidify, then to dissolve. So after these initial experiments, I kind of was set on xanthan gum, which is this food additive. It's derived from bacteria, but it's often used to thicken like soups and sauces in cooking. And this is because the plastic in the xanthan gum, when it's mixed together with water, it hardens when it's dry, and it's really durable. It can support a lot of weight. Also, just touching on that durability of plastics and the xanthan gum, you can just rinse and reuse the plastics indefinitely just due to their durability. You can kind of scrub it together with water. You could even use solvents if you needed to, if it was the right type of plastic, to get this sort of binder off of it without damaging the plastics in some cases. The other thing with the xanthan gum that differs from some of the other materials that I tested is that this one it extruded nicely. It kind of was a smooth paste that was, viscous enough to maintain its shape when turning into a three-dimensional form, but it didn't sort of bind up inside the ceramic 3D printer tube as it was compressed. So some of the materials, if you've ever had like wet sand in your hand, you've tried to kind of compress it and it just sort of compacts. It would kind of do that and act like a suspension. So here's a video of some really high quality practice-based research happening. So there's a lot of trial and error involved in this process. For example, the xanthan gum is incredibly sticky, but it doesn't want to stick to the acrylic 3D printer bed, and sometimes not even itself. So here is me trying to try all sorts of different ways to get this material to actually stick and start the 3D print. So returning to the actor network theory as a material semiotic method for examining these relationships between actants in this network, I'm just going to briefly explore some of this messiness of the circular economy by looking at some of the human and more than human actants and dissolvable furniture objects. So through Ant, we can start to uncover how these relationships between designers, makers, food additives like xanthan gum, and mold might influence this network and the circular economy more broadly. So from the perspective of Ant, we've got these dissolvable furniture experiments that can be understood as these interconnected networks of human and more than human actants. So for example, this network would include, the human designer or maker, the more than humans like the xanthan gum, the plastic waste, the 3D printer, the mold, as well as ideas and practices around design, materials, circular economy, and 3D printing. And in terms of material semiotics in this example, we've got, remember, material between things and semiotic between these ideas or concepts. We've got some different kind of interpretations and of these kind of interconnections. So one of them could be that making objects that dissolve could maybe shift someone's acquisitive instincts around design, maybe around their ideas of value and ownership. And so on the one hand, you've got this provisional furniture, these objects that would resist ownership, and maybe they could support the circular economy's emphasis on sharing objects, materials, and resources within the first loop of the technical cycle. Not only that, but this dissolvable objects, if they're owned or used for too long, then you have this more than human act, this mold beginning to grow and compelling the user or the designer to, get on with it and dissolve this again and turn it into something else. So dissolvable furniture and objects could also empower environmentally sustainable individuals to modify or to replace their furniture themselves when it wears out, instead of discarding it. So this might impact the technical cycle of the circular economy by keeping these materials in the system longer and then ultimately conserving some energy. On the other hand, this dissolvability of the furniture or the object exhibits this kind of dissolvability of form, but also a transformation of these materials. And as the durability of plastic material makes it incredibly chemically resistant and all these kinds of things, it's almost indefinitely reusable. So from a circular economy perspective, the interpretation of these experiments really privileges this idea of materials over the form, whatever you make it into, it doesn't matter. But you're really kind of just capturing and reclaiming that material. That's what's important. Unfortunately, capitalism, another more than human affecting this network, maintains an interest in some of these material technologies. So should this, plastic xanthan gum and its associated production processes, work really well, be deemed marketable, then this innovation could be co-opted and work against the circular economy. And then on the other hand, an issue with these dissolvable experiments is that being able to 3D print new furniture or objects on a whim could really encourage this consumptive aspects of capitalism. So, not to mention there's energy, resource costs associated with these processes. For example, operating a 3D printer, just repeatedly making new furniture and objects whenever you wanted, the water used to dissolve this kind of xanthan gum material, or the production of the xanthan gum and the manufacturing of that material. But overall, you've got this actor network theory approach that offers a way to analyze some of these material and semiotic dimensions of this kind of social phenomenon within the circular economy by understanding them as the result of these complex and transitory constellations and relationships between humans and more than humans. And so moving forward, I've recently submitted this project for a Create New South Wales Fellowship in conjunction with a local museum. And so the hope is that by being able to reproduce these museum collection furniture and objects, things that can be indefinitely made, exhibited, dissolved, and remade in this very short period of time, say like a month, for example, this project would use this idea of dissolvability to explore notions of cultural heritage, aesthetics. As you can see, the kind of furniture side table on the right-hand side isn't, that nice looking. Beauty, museum acquisitions, valuations of ownership, loaning and borrowing intellectual property, and open and shared resources. So this project would bring forward some of the cultural significance of these museum artifacts, recontextualizing them through some of these radical circular economy loops with the potential to expand the design, reproduction, and loaning capacities of museums. And finally, this kind of dissolvable artifacts would allow museums to avoid waste, perhaps with circular materials, loan temporary replicas of objects out from their collection to, say, researchers or other galleries and other institutions, and keep them, keep reusing them with this limited and sustainable material stock. So while I wait for that, in the meantime, I'll keep experimenting, but that's kind of my work in progress update for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Wow, that was fabulous. We've got about 15 minutes, which is a kind of a shame because 4 fantastic presentations. So thank you so much, Nicole, Peter, Consuelo, and Matt. That was really fantastic. Are there any particular questions coming from our audience that you'd like to ask our speakers now? I'm just trying to work out how to do the chat. I thought just thinking like on the go, you know, I did, in terms of the sequencing of the speakers today, I was kind of thinking about an equitable kind of sequencing. But I actually think the way, you know, the place of everyone talking really synced up beautifully, like, you know, so I was really, you know, the threads were very strong, you know, made stronger through that whole process. So yeah, there's a lot to take in and absorb. So if anyone's actually got, yes, I agree, Mark. If anyone's got anything they'd like to ask our speakers, do you want to actually put your mic on and ask? Be brave. No? Well, that's actually quite cool. It means that we don't have to rush things. What I actually thought was interesting, for example, and I'm just trying to go back to Nicole and Peter, is this link that was made between notions of place. So that's why I thought that sequencing worked really well. And Peter, you know, your approach to different mediums, different notions of scale in relation to, you know, immersing yourself in the environment actually makes great connections to Nicole's approach to place and culture and relational values through materials. I'm also, and that leading through to Consuelo with your, you know, your analysis of space leading to, you know, your explorations of glass. What I'm interested in with the three of you is this idea of atmosphere that you that was highlighted. So Nicole, this was kind of hinted at through the 3 chair studies that you explored, where, you know, the objects themselves actually created a relational atmosphere. That was one way of looking at it. And then Peter, also, particularly with the site-specific work you're dealing with now at Hazelhurst, there was this kind of, you know, there's a presence within that assembly of pieces that's ongoing. You know, there's a never-ending notion. And then, of course, the atmospheric qualities of the mediums, you know, that you're exploring, Consuelo, is also very evident. Is there anything you want to say about that kind of, you know, I'm drawing connections here, but that kind of that relational value of materials through to creating notions or atmospheric experiences?
Yeah, I think like a lot of the works that I do, you're meant to actually touch them and engage with them. You know, the chairs and the tables, people are meant to sit on them. And it was quite interesting when the Powerhouse acquired the 6-seaters and the table, and they were like, can people sit on them? And I'm like, yeah, of course they can. They need to like engage with it. And it's utilitarian, you know. And it was really interesting because during COVID, because of all of the really high the things they were using to spray all the surfaces was super toxic, and it started to make changes to the top, and they were all like losing their minds at the Powerhouse, like, oh my God, the material, it's, you know, it's affecting it. And I was like, well, actually, it's sort of part of its journey, isn't it? Like that becomes part of its story, is that COVID came, it had this effect, and this is the new version, you know. I think they ended up trying to sand it back and redoing like a bit of a finish on it. But it was just really interesting, that idea of material being able to age and warp or change over time. And that, you know, people yeah, people definitely needed to engage with it, and they use that space for children when they come for to look at the work. So they did when that exhibition was open, and that's what I really wanted, was for them to touch and feel and engage. And when they'd sit in that space, you know, it, like I said, it creates that little unity or that little community, and it's those feelings that are the most important sort of part of a lot of these works. But I think the Shimu work, I think, was really interesting in that it had a real smell to it, that one. You know, and that was a whole nother sort of sensory thing that materiality could bring to it. So yeah, the sheep's wool had that real lanolin smell, and the whole and I actually played on that in the exhibition when we had it at the gallery at UNSW in the student sort of space. And I had I'd got some emu oil as well and some lanolin, and I had that as a part of the work, was the smell. So the materiality was not sort of visible, but it affected you in other ways. Yeah.
Peter and Consuelo, do you have anything to add to that, particularly the smell of things? I'm sure that's, I mean, I'm just thinking, Peter, with the timber you're working with, that actually that physicality, all body experience is very much there. And Consuelo, working with glass, the smell of heat, for example, you know, is also, and likewise, Matt, you're working with a heating process as well. So yeah, that's all that kind of sensory aspect. Go, Peter.
I was just thinking about what Nicole was saying, relationships with people and relationships with materials. What's really interesting is, because I'm outside, the atmosphere, it's sort of, I can only go there if it's not raining, or it depends on the climate, the weather, if it's too hot. And I found that really interesting too. So looking for gaps of time where you can just run in there and do things and then leave. And like I was saying, the relationship with people, not just the materials, but watching the materials change. Norfolk, its pine is really light. It's almost like balsa wood. And when I hand it to people, hand them a chunk, they have this sudden kind of realization that it's different to what they expected. It smells fantastic. You can imagine what it smells like. And also too, there's a couple of Norfolk pines within 20 or 30 meters. And I often think about, I wonder what they think about this idea of this kind of relation to these other bits of timber being cut up on the ground. And then finally, you know, magpies coming down. I have the magpies visit me. They're used to me now, which is fantastic. They come up, unless the chainsaw's going, and they actually pull apart things. They're like, you know, everyone's a critic. They come in and they actually, the sawdust balls that are hanging, they're actually pulling them apart and taking them somewhere else. And again, I would have had no idea this was all going to happen, but it's made it really special, relating back to atmosphere and, you know, relationships.
Consuelo, do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, look, I was thinking about having shown the work from second year, and just thinking about how far back I mean, I sort of showed it to talk about a kind of sort of sustained engagement with an idea, and also with materials, or dealing with materials, and how you can kind of keep almost talking about the same thing for, I don't know, however many years, but you just kind of shift the way that you approach it. But in that instance of doing that work, of course, that rearranging of materials within my own home completely changed my environment, in the sense that I couldn't access the kitchen, or I couldn't sort of, you know, walk through a doorway and things like that. But I was thinking, as Nicole was talking about, the way that you kind of it's like your own experience with the materials, and then the difference between that to the audience's engagement with the materials. So the kinds of intimacy that you have with the material yourself, and the enjoyment of something. So working with felt, for example, for me, that wool felt that I have has that kind of beautiful smell of lanolin as well. And it's such a beautiful shift for me. And so nice to work with as a counterpoint to working with metal, or glass that, you know, I'm constantly, you know, cut or burnt, or, you know, there's all these things that your body has as a sort of an engagement with those processes and materials. And then, of course, when you go into the, you know, into the glass making, that's a whole different range of things. So there's that physicality of yourself with the materials. But I think in terms of an audience, for me, the materials end up becoming a little bit more like a sensation that you can't put your finger on necessarily. And sometimes it does really go back to that perception. So you can't touch things, or like even through mirror, I guess it's a space, like mirror opens up a space that you can visually enter, but you can't physically enter. And so a lot of the things within that environment are almost more sort of intangible rather than like an actual smell or yeah, that kind of immediacy of that impact.
And Matt, just because we've only got a couple of minutes left, just kind of, is there any way that you can add to this idea of, you know, a kind of all body sensory experience with working with the materials? I'm intrigued in particular by this idea of, you know, objects that are sort of viewed as these permanent things, but you're, you know, your kind of questioning of that in terms of circular economies. So yeah, do you want to just comment a little bit about that?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think it's just working with these materials, maybe less so with the kind of dissolvable stuff, but more with like the heating and melting of the plastics. There's all these different kinds of smells, and some of them, you know, it's quite harmful plastic, you know, volatile organic compounds coming off of them, so you have to wear a respirator and things like that. But some of them do have these, you know, different plastics. You could identify them by their different smells and what they do when they burn and all these kinds of things. And so that's, yeah, just like with working with the materials in this sort of multi-sensory way, you know, there's all these different smells. There's what they heat up at different temperatures. You have to, you know, wear gloves, and you try not to get burnt and things like that while you're working with it. I mean, yeah, I mean, it does have that kind of multi-sensory sort of aspect to it as well. But with the dissolvable stuff, I mean, maybe the food additives, they do have like these kinds of sweet smells. I haven't really tasted them, that kind of thing, but yeah, there's something with that. Another thing too is I was thinking about just trying to capture some of these gases and compounds and things that come off these melting things, but nothing really came of it. It's just more of a comment. I used like different filters and things like that to try to actually get these, you know, this sort of smoke or steam or whatever is kind of coming off these plastics, to trap it in a filter and see what, you know, could I make something from that? But I think it's getting too high level and scientific for me. But I don't know, maybe there's something there in the future.
Creating form out of that process, potentially.
Yeah.
All right, thank you so much. I think it's 2:02, so this is probably it. Once again, I want to thank the speakers, Nicole, Peter, Consuelo, Matt, and for everyone today for you know, attending this forum. Thank you, Bianca and Ollie, and all the best with this stage in the term.
Thanks, Zoe, for your wonderful chairing, and to the speakers. We really appreciate this kicking off the Art Forum series, Research Forum series, sorry.
Thanks, everybody.
Oh,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone. That was great.
Thank you.
Wonderful
Work.
presentations.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.